The story of what happened to Ford Focus RS begins many years before its discontinuation, woven through a network of decisions, ambitions, engineering gambles, and changing market realities that would eventually shape its fate. When Ford introduced the third-generation Focus RS for the 2016 model year, the company was not simply launching another performance variant. It was unleashing the culmination of decades of European rally heritage and finally giving global markets access to a machine that had long been admired from afar. The RS nameplate had always symbolized Ford at its most daring, with previous generations existing as limited, Europe-only rarities designed to win rallies and dominate twisting backroads. But the third-generation model represented a shift in philosophy. This RS was meant for the world, meant to prove that Ford could still build an uncompromising driver's car while competing directly with the rising tide of premium hot hatches from Germany and Japan. That global ambition came with enormous internal pressure. Ford engineers wanted to create a car that wouldn't simply match the competition, but embarrass it. And they did exactly that with a 350 horsepower turbocharged 2.3-liter EcoBoost engine, a pioneering all-wheel drive system with active rear torque vectoring, and a chassis tuned with a kind of mischievous confidence that made it feel alive even at low speeds. The car landed with explosive effect. Reviews were euphoric. Enthusiasts lined up with deposits, and dealers found themselves unable to meet demand. For a brief moment, the Focus RS wasn't just a performance car, it was a cultural event. But beneath the surface of this excitement, Ford executives were quietly aware that the RS rode on precarious ground. The very characteristics that made it sensational, a highly boosted engine, specialized drivetrain, reinforced body structure, unique cooling systems, and bespoke suspension hardware, also made it expensive to build and difficult to justify in the long term. Its success masked the uncomfortable truth that the RS was the product of a rapidly closing window in automotive history, a window where regulation still left room for small batch enthusiast projects, and where internal combustion hot hatches could freely push the envelope. Even as journalists were praising the car's playful drift mode and volcanic acceleration, behind closed doors the realities of emissions targets, cost constraints, and platform lifecycle planning were already casting shadows over any potential successor. Engineers knew that the current Focus platform was nearing its end, and designing an all-new RS would require fresh investments that were becoming harder to defend. The third-generation RS felt like a triumph, but within Ford's product planning teams, it was understood as both a high point and possibly the final act in a long lineage of high-performance compact cars. The public saw a celebration, foresaw the last spark of a formula that was becoming increasingly incompatible with the industry's future. What ultimately makes the story of the Focus RS so compelling is the tension between its outward success and the hidden fragility of its long-term viability. To enthusiasts, it appeared unstoppable, a rare case where a mass-market automaker built something reckless, emotional, and enthusiast-driven at a time when most companies were retreating into safe, efficient, risk-averse design. Yet the truth is that the car's arrival came at a moment when the automotive world was already pivoting toward electrification, SUVs, and strict fleet emissions limits. Even as it thrilled drivers, the RS was edging closer to being labeled a corporate anomaly. Its engineering team had poured everything into making it spectacular, perhaps knowing deep down that the opportunity to build something so focused might never come again. The car's production run, which lasted only a few short years, captured a fleeting moment where passion briefly overcame pragmatism. And while the world cheered the return of Ford's global rally icon, the seeds of its disappearance had already been planted. One of the most decisive forces shaping the fate of the Ford Focus RS was the massive tidal shift in emissions regulations that swept across Europe during the mid to late 2010s, a shift so profound that it reshaped entire product lineups and forced automakers to rethink what kinds of vehicles they could justify building. While the RS thrilled enthusiasts with its 350 horsepower punch and its unapologetically aggressive engineering, those same traits made it increasingly incompatible with the realities of corporate fleet emissions averages, numbers that governments monitored closely, enforced strictly, and penalized heavily. The European Union introduced increasingly severe CO2 reduction targets, and automakers were no longer judged only on individual models, but on the total emissions output of their entire product portfolio. High-performance, low-volume cars like the RS, cars that produce significantly more emissions than the average hatchback, carried disproportionate weight in these calculations, essentially forcing Ford to counterbalance them by selling a far larger number of low-emission vehicles. Every RS sold meant Ford had to sell many more small, efficient cars to avoid fines, and as consumer taste drifted toward SUVs, even that balancing act became more difficult. Inside Ford, the conversation shifted from, can we build another RS, to, can we afford the emissions burden of building another RS? Engineers and product planners began running simulations showing how much CO2 headroom a new RS would require, and the numbers kept coming back bleak. Other manufacturers faced the same problems but had different solutions. Some leaned into electrification early, some reduced their performance offerings, and some simply accepted higher penalties because they had luxury margins to absorb them. Ford, positioned as a mass-market brand fighting to maintain profitability, did not have the luxury brand cushion that companies like Mercedes-AMG or BMW's M Division used to justify high-emission performance cars. Every gram of CO2 mattered, and every deviation from targets cost real money. This broader regulatory landscape meant that building a niche performance car was no longer just an engineering challenge, but a financial liability that could drag down the company's compliance across the entire continent. The internal debate grew even more complex when Ford examined what it would take to engineer a next-generation RS that could withstand this new regulatory reality. Electrification appeared to be the obvious answer. Hybridization could cut emissions while increasing power, but the engineering teams quickly realized that adding hybrid hardware to an RS wasn't a simple drop-in upgrade. Batteries needed space, and the Focus platform was never designed to accommodate the kind of high-output hybrid systems required to meaningfully offset emissions while preserving performance. A full hybrid would add immense weight, compromising the razor-sharp handling that defined the RS character. A mild hybrid system wouldn't do enough to reduce emissions. A plug-in hybrid, in theory, offered the best emissions credits but required a complete restructuring of the car's architecture, cooling pathways, and drivetrain layout. The AWD system would need to be redesigned from scratch, and the car would balloon in weight, straying far from the light, aggressive personality fans expected. The cost estimates for such a redesign kept climbing, and the returns kept shrinking. At the same time, diesel scandals and tightening WLTP testing protocols created a more hostile landscape for turbocharged engines in general, particularly those tuned for high performance. Regulations didn't just limit CO2. They scrutinized NOx, particulates, and temperature management under a variety of real-world conditions, forcing engineers to add more complex emission control systems that sap power, increase weight, and reduce packaging freedom. The 2.3-liter EcoBoost that powered the RS would need substantial re-engineering to meet new standards, and simply carrying it forward was no longer viable. The question became almost philosophical. If Ford had to change the engine, the AWD system, the platform, and the emissions technology, was a new vehicle still an RS in spirit, or just an expensive, compromised imitation created to satisfy regulations rather than push boundaries? As these factors converged, looming financial penalties, rising development costs, platform constraints, and politically driven emissions rules, it became clear that the pressures weren't going away. Instead, they were tightening year by year, squeezing the RS into an increasingly tiny corner of feasibility. Ford executives eventually saw that the RS program, once a source of pride and engineering brilliance, was turning into a regulatory burden that required disproportionate resources to justify. Even though the third-generation Focus RS had been a commercial and cultural success, the regulatory winds had shifted so dramatically that continuing the lineage would be like swimming against a rip current. The RS wasn't killed by lack of demand or declining performance enthusiasm. It was overwhelmed by a new era where numbers on government spreadsheets carried more weight than horsepower figures on spec sheets. The world was changing, and the RS, one of the most exhilarating machines Ford had ever created, simply couldn't outrun the rules closing around it. As Ford navigated the shifting global market, the Focus lineup itself entered a period of profound transition that would quietly but decisively shape the fate of the RS. When the next generation Focus was being planned for its 2018 global launch, Ford faced a rapidly changing landscape, one in which traditional sedans and hatchbacks were losing ground to SUVs and crossovers at a speed few predicted. In North America especially, the market had shifted so dramatically that Ford made the landmark decision to stop selling most passenger cars altogether. including the Focus, and redirect resources toward trucks, crossovers, and electrified models. This wasn't a temporary adjustment, but a foundational restructuring of Ford's strategy. When the company announced that the new Focus wouldn't be sold in the United States, it sent a shockwave through the enthusiast community. But inside Ford, the implications ran even deeper. The RS program had always relied heavily on global sales to justify its existence. The U.S. had become a major market for the third-generation RS, generating thousands of sales and immense hype. Removing that market from the equation meant cutting out one of the RS financial pillars. The next-generation Focus platform itself was designed with cost efficiency and global standardization in mind, but it wasn't engineered with a high-performance halo model at the center of its philosophy the way the previous platform had been. When the third-generation RS was greenlit, Ford's One Ford strategy was in full force, encouraging shared global development and allowing specialized variants like the RS to ride on the economies of scale created by massive worldwide production. But as Ford rolled back its global car strategy, the business case for a low-volume, high-cost model like the RS grew weaker. Without the U.S. market, and with shrinking traditional car sales in Europe and Asia, the potential volume for a new RS was far smaller. The ST could survive in this new environment because it required fewer bespoke components and could be integrated more easily into the standard Focus production flow. But the RS was a completely different beast. Its unique AWD system, strengthened chassis, specialized cooling architecture, and numerous exclusive parts meant Ford would need to engineer an entire performance ecosystem around a model that now had significantly reduced sales potential. That imbalance threatened to make the RS an expensive indulgence rather than a viable product. Another hidden complication emerged from the new Focus's architecture and engineering priorities. Because Ford was concentrating on efficiency, cost optimization, and packaging improvements for mainstream buyers, the platform evolution didn't align neatly with what an RS variant would need to thrive. The new car had a different suspension layout, a redesigned body-in-white structure, and a fresh electronics architecture for driver assist, infotainment, and safety systems. While these changes were beneficial for everyday models, they introduced obstacles for an RS, particularly for fitting the sophisticated AWD system and high-output engine necessary to surpass the outgoing model. Engineers studying the new platform's geometry, weight distribution, and available mounting points realized they would have to engage in extensive re-engineering just to bring it up to par with the previous RS, let alone surpass it. That meant added development costs, more time, and more specialized work that wasn't easily shared with other Focus variants. In an era where every dollar spent needed to align with a global strategy focused on electrification and volume growth, dedicating such resources to a niche performance car became harder to justify. There was also an internal cultural shift happening at Ford that subtly worked against a new RS project. During the years when the previous RS was developed, Ford's executive team strongly supported building global halo performance cars as a way of enhancing brand excitement. Vehicles like the GT Supercar, the Mustang Shelby GT350, and the Focus RS represented a unified push to create emotional, enthusiast-led offerings. But as leadership changed and global pressures mounted, priorities reoriented towards software-driven features, EV development, and the strengthening of profit-heavy segments like trucks and SUVs. The emotional argument for an RS remained strong among engineers and fans, but emotional arguments alone no longer carried weight against cold financial and regulatory realities. The idea of building a new RS became less of a passionate engineering mission and more of a difficult corporate negotiation where the costs and compromises overshadowed the excitement. Ultimately, the restructuring of Ford's global car strategy caused a domino effect that rippled through the RS program in ways the public rarely saw. Removing the U.S. from the sales equation reduced volume expectations. The new Focus platform introduced engineering obstacles that increased development costs, and shifting corporate priorities diverted resources toward more strategic initiatives. Even though the RS name carried immense brand value among enthusiasts, brand value alone couldn't counterbalance the shrinking market for performance hatchbacks, the burden of regulatory compliance, and the practical challenges of adapting the RS formula to the new generation of the Focus. What had once been a global halo model for Ford became, almost overnight, a regional niche with diminishing support. The RS didn't disappear because Ford lost interest in performance. It disappeared because the very structure of the company's global product strategy no longer had room for it. The stage on which the RS once shined had been dismantled, leaving the car without a home in Ford's new world. As Ford's engineers began seriously exploring the possibility of a next-generation Focus RS, the most daunting challenge quickly became the powertrain. The outgoing RS had been built around a 2.3-liter EcoBoost engine, itself already pushed near the upper limits of what a mass-market turbocharged four-cylinder could reliably deliver on-pump fuel. With tightening emission standards across Europe and regions adopting increasingly strict real-world testing procedures, simply carrying the engine forward was no longer a viable option. It would need extensive redesigns to meet new NOx and particulate rules, more complex catalytic systems for post-turbine cleanup, and revised engine mapping that would likely reduce its characteristic punch. Engineers knew that trying to squeeze more power out of the same displacement while also lowering emissions was a technical contradiction. When the idea of electrification emerged as a solution, either mild hybridization or a full hybrid system, its surface-level appeal evaporated as soon as engineers began mapping out actual implementation. A mild hybrid setup could offer slightly lower emissions, but not enough performance benefit to justify the added weight, cost, and complexity. A plug-in hybrid system offered regulatory advantages, but introduced engineering nightmares. Batteries needed to be placed somewhere in a chassis that was never designed for high-voltage storage. Thermal management requirements increased dramatically, and the packaging constraints risked compromising rear passenger space, cargo room, and weight distribution. The more advanced idea was to create a hybrid AWD system using an electric rear axle, similar to what Volvo or some premium European brands had introduced. On paper, this approach could have delivered blistering acceleration and satisfying torque vectoring without relying entirely on mechanical components. But when Ford's engineering teams performed detailed feasibility studies, the practical obstacles multiplied. An electric rear motor required not only packaging space but robust cooling channels, high-voltage wiring paths, and crash protection structures that the new Focus platform simply didn't have in place. The cost of redesigning the rear floor pan to accommodate a motor and battery pack was immense, and doing it for a low-volume vehicle like the RS meant Ford couldn't amortize those costs across mass-market trims the way Toyota or Volkswagen might. Even if the engineering hurdles could be overcome, the hybrid RS would be significantly heavier, a quality fundamentally at odds with the RS character. The third-generation RS had earned praise for feeling alive, playful, and eager to rotate, thanks in part to its relatively light footprint compared to AWD rivals. Adding batteries and electric motors could easily push the car's weight well beyond 1,600 kilograms, blunting its razor-sharp agility, slowing its reflexes, and fundamentally altering what made an RS feel like an RS. Engineers worried that fans expecting the raw, mechanical, rally-bred personality of the previous car would instead get something more digital, more muted, and more appliance-like, attributes acceptable in a mainstream hybrid, but unacceptable in a car whose identity rested on visceral sensation. Beyond weight and packaging, there was a financial aspect of engineering such a powertrain, and this became one of the biggest nails in the RS coffin. Creating a hybrid system capable of surviving track days, hard launches, and prolonged high torque usage is vastly more expensive than building a hybrid system for a commuter car. High-performance hybrid components require specialized cooling loops, high-output battery modules, stronger inverters, and durable electric motors, all of which cost significantly more than standard hybrid hardware. Ford ran cost projections for developing a bespoke hybrid RS powertrain, and the numbers were sobering. Because the RS was a low-volume halo product, Ford couldn't share enough of its components with other models to keep the project financially sustainable. The company's electrification budget was already being directed toward high-volume EVs and the Mustang Mach-E performance variants, programs that promised higher profit margins, cleaner regulatory standings, and far greater market impact. Asking executives to divert tens of millions of dollars from strategic EV development to build a highly specialized hybrid hatchback for a shrinking enthusiast segment became an almost impossible sell. Further complicating the situation was the emotional and philosophical dilemma raised by electrification. Many within Ford Performance questioned whether an electrified RS, even if technically feasible, would be worthy of the RS name. The RS legacy was built on aggressive, mechanical, analog-feeling performance. Turbocharged lag followed by violent boost, mechanical AWD claws, the sensation of a chassis dancing beneath the driver. Could a hybrid car, with its silent low-speed operation and heavy reliance on computer-controlled torque delivery, ever evoke the same character? The RS brand was cherished for its authenticity, its purity, and its refusal to dilute its personality for mainstream appeal. A hybrid RS risked feeling like a compromise, a car defined by regulations rather than passion. Some engineers argued that the only honest path forward would be to make the RS fully electric, but that idea was quickly dismissed because the Focus platform couldn't support an EV architecture, and because Ford's electric halo was already assigned to Mustang-branded vehicles. The RS identity, once so strong and clear, was now caught between an environmental future it wasn't designed for and a regulatory present it could no longer survive. As Ford continued exploring the technical and financial demands of a next-generation RS, the project gradually shifted from challenging to unviable. Each engineering solution created new complications. Each cost projection highlighted new vulnerabilities. Each attempt to meet emissions revealed new compromises. It became a painful paradox. The more Ford tried to modernize the RS, the further the car drifted away from what made the RS special in the first place. By the end, the internal consensus was that the RS could be reborn only at the cost of its soul. And if preserving the RS meant betraying the RS, then the project no longer made sense, from a business standpoint or philosophical one. The decision to cancel the next-generation Focus RS was not made quickly or casually. It was a result of years of technical studies, cost analyses, regulatory forecasts, and internal debates about brand identity. In the end, the engineering challenges weren't just obstacles. They were signals that the world in which the RS once thrived had changed beyond recognition. The RS formula, born from turbocharged combustion, mechanical cleverness, and analog aggression, simply had no natural home in an era increasingly defined by electrification, compliance, and software. As Ford's leadership mapped out the company's long-term performance strategy, the place of the Focus RS within that strategy grew increasingly uncertain. The automotive world was rapidly transforming, and the shift wasn't merely about emissions or engine technology. It was about redefining what performance meant in an era dominated by electrification, connectivity, and shifting consumer expectations. Ford performance, one centered on mechanical engineering feats, turbocharged combustion engines, and motorsport-inspired driving dynamics, now had to evolve into an organization capable of shaping Ford's future identity in the electric age. That meant channeling resources into vehicles that not only delivered speed and excitement, but also acted as rolling showcases of the company's technological direction, especially those that aligned with EV platforms, advanced software integration, and future-proof branding. In this new landscape, the Focus RS, brutal analog-spirited, combustion-driven, and rooted in the traditions of rallying, was becoming an outlier. It represented the best of what performance cars used to be, not what Ford needed them to become. Internally, Ford was realigning the halo hierarchy, a strategy that defines which models represent the brand at the highest levels of the lineup. The RS badge had long served as a halo for Ford's European performance division, delivering prestige and recognition far beyond its sales numbers. But its influence, while intense among enthusiasts, had limited reach globally, and halo models are only justified if they elevate the brand at scale. Meanwhile, Ford had a far more powerful global icon to leverage, the Mustang. When the company committed to electrification, it made the bold decision to attach the Mustang name to its first performance EV, the Mustang Mach-E, a move that required massive engineering investment, marketing muscle, and cultural repositioning. The Mach-E GT and GT Performance Edition were being shaped into Ford's new performance flagships, positioned as high-torque, software-enhanced, EV-era successors to what the RS once symbolized. With such an enormous brand pivot underway, the Focus RS began to look not only redundant but potentially distracting. Allocating resources to a niche, combustion-based hatchback could dilute the impact of Ford's EV performance ambitions. Another factor in the shifting strategy was the growing importance of modular electric platforms. Ford was pouring billions into next-generation EV architectures like G2 and performance variants derived from it. These electric platforms allowed the company to develop multiple models from shared components, motors, battery packs, inverters, thermal systems, making every dollar spent far more efficient than designing a specialized IC-based performance system for a single vehicle like the RS. The Focus RS, by contrast, required bespoke engineering for its AWD system, drivetrain, suspension tuning, cooling solutions, and reinforcement structures. In a world where profitability depended heavily on scale and efficiency, the RS represented the opposite, a passionate, small-scale engineering project that required disproportionately high investment. Ford executives increasingly viewed such projects as luxuries a company could indulge in while transitioning its entire business model. The RS wasn't simply a performance car. It was a product of an old industrial logic that no longer matched Ford's future needs. Marketing trends also played a role. The global hot hatch market, once a thriving battleground for enthusiast brands, was shrinking. Younger buyers were gravitating toward crossovers, SUVs, and tech-centric vehicles, and the social media-era perception of what constituted cool performance was shifting toward EVs with instantly available torque, futuristic styling, and advanced driver-assist tech. The RS, for all its charisma and authentic character, didn't fit neatly into that world. Its appeal was raw and mechanical and grounded in driving skill, attributes increasingly overshadowed by a culture that valued digital features, customization, screen interfaces, and acceleration figures achieved through electrified torque rather than combustion complexity. Ford's marketing teams recognized that the RS name, while legendary among enthusiasts, lacked the universal recognition needed to justify large investments in a changing consumer landscape. Halo models had to speak to the broad future of the brand, not just a nostalgic past. Inside Ford Performance, there was also a growing understanding that the next era of performance wouldn't be defined primarily by compact hatchbacks, but by electric SUVs, trucks, and crossovers that could deliver shocking levels of acceleration thanks to electric motors. The spotlight was moving toward vehicles like the Mach-E GT and the Lightning Performance variants. These vehicles had far higher profit margins than the Focus RS could ever achieve, and they aligned perfectly with regulatory incentives favoring low-emission models. From a strategic perspective, the RS no longer occupied a central or essential position. It became a side project competing for resources with vehicles that could meaningfully impact Ford's global market share, regulatory compliance, and corporate image. The RS was emotionally priceless but strategically expendable. Even as these forces pushed the RS toward irrelevance, the affection for the RS inside Ford Performance never disappeared. Engineers and designers respected what the RS represented: a defiant, uncompromising celebration of the driving experience at a time when such cars were becoming rare. But passion alone couldn't counterbalance the direction the company was moving in. When cost analysts, platform strategists, and product planners compared the investment required to build a new RS with the returns offered by electrified Halo models, the contrast was stark. A next-generation RS, whether hybrid or fully electric, would require uniquely expensive development while offering limited regulatory benefits and modest sales. An electric Mustang-branded performance vehicle would offer the opposite: huge marketing reach, regulatory advantages, reusable componentry, and alignment with Ford's future identity. In the end, the shifting performance strategy didn't merely push the RS aside. It rendered it obsolete in the eyes of Ford's future-focused leadership. The RS badge, forged in the fires of rally stages and celebrated by drivers who value mechanical honesty, had no natural place in performance vision centered on EV platforms, scalable architectures, software-enhanced driving dynamics, and global Halo branding. The RS wasn't canceled because it lacked value, but because its value lay in philosophy the industry was rapidly leaving behind. The world was moving towards silent speed, instant torque, and digital refinement, while the RS represented the growl of turbocharged combustion, the drama of mechanical torque vectoring, and the purity of a chassis tuned for raw human engagement. The new performance era belonged to technology and electrification. The RS belonged to emotion and tradition. Ford had to choose which future build, and the RS, for all its greatness, simply didn't fit into the blueprint of the world Ford was stepping into. When Ford finally announced in early 2020 that there would be no next-generation Focus RS, the statement arrived with an abruptness that caught many enthusiasts off guard. It was brief, almost understated, as though the company hoped the news would slip quietly into the background of a world increasingly dominated by electrification headlines. But beneath that simple announcement lay years of internal debate, technical roadblocks, shifting market dynamics, and philosophical conflicts about what a performance car should be in a rapidly changing industry. For the enthusiasts who had worshipped the RS badge for decades, the cancellation felt sudden, almost surreal. How could a car that had achieved such global acclaim, such instant cult hero status, simply end without a fight? But within Ford, the decision represented not a quick pivot, but a reluctant conclusion to a long period of introspection, one in which engineers, financial planners, and executives gradually accepted that the world the RS had thrived in no longer existed. The Focus RS didn't die because of a single fatal flaw. It faded because 1,000 small realities converged until there was simply no room left for it to breathe. What makes the ending of the Focus RS story so emotionally powerful is that it wasn't a failure. It was a victim of success arriving at the wrong moment in history. The third-generation RS had been a sensation not long before its cancellation. Its drift mode went viral. Its AWD system was hailed as revolutionary, and its arrival in the U.S. had exposed an entirely new audience to Ford's European performance DNA. It seemed like the kind of car that would spark an enduring lineage, a future filled with even more advanced and outrageous versions. Yet, as Ford's internal priorities evolved, the RS found itself increasingly out of alignment with the company's strategic direction. Even though it delivered excitement, attention, and cultural capital, those intangible benefits couldn't outweigh the concrete challenges of regulations, cost, and platform compatibility. The RS was living on borrowed time, its glory years coinciding with a moment when the automotive industry was undergoing the most dramatic shift since the dawn of mass production. The beloved hot hatch, built on the principles of combustion, mechanical grip, and emotional theatrics, suddenly found itself on the wrong side of the tide. Enthusiasts hoped, perhaps even assumed, that Ford would find a way to adapt the RS formula to the new world, that hybrid systems would be refined, electric torque would be embraced, or a radically new chassis could be engineered. But inside Ford, the calculations didn't add up. Electrifying the RS in a meaningful way would require a platform that didn't exist. Building a bespoke solution would drain resources better spent on EV programs that promise mass market appeal and regulatory advantages. And turning the RS into a full EV would conflict with Ford's developing Mustang-based electric performance identity. Even worse, an electrified RS risked losing the essence of the RS. The car's mythology was tied to its raw brutality, its explosive turbo surge, its mechanical AWD theatrics, the sensation of the rear end coming alive under throttle, all qualities inherently dulled or transformed by electrification. To build a future RS that fully satisfied regulatory and strategic demands, Ford would have needed to abandon the purity that defined the RS name. In other words, the only RS that made business sense would not have been an RS in spirit. As time passed, the legacy of the third-generation RS grew stronger, not weaker. Its short production window turned it into a modern classic almost instantly. Values stabilized rather than plummeted. Owners began treating their RS models less like disposable hatchbacks and more like future collectibles. Forums, meetups, and clubs kept the legend alive. The RS had not outstayed its welcome. It had left too early, which only magnified its mystique. At the same time, the automotive landscape around it continued accelerating toward an electrified future. Performance became increasingly defined by software-tuned torque maps, battery temperature management, and the silent violence of electric acceleration. Cars like the Mach-E GT demonstrated Ford's new vision: big torque numbers, sophisticated electronics, and instant response. These vehicles lacked the combustion theatrics of the RS, but they offered a new kind of performance narrative, one Ford needed to embrace to remain competitive and compliant. In the years following the RS cancellation, its absence came to symbolize more than just the end of a model line. It marked the end of an entire era of automotive enthusiasm. Hot hatches had represented rebellion for decades: affordable performance, youthful energy, and mechanical engagement. The RS in particular embodied the absolute peak of that ethos, pushing the boundaries of what a compact car could physically and emotionally deliver. But as the industry shifted, the values that had defined the RS became increasingly incompatible with the future. Its passing felt like the closing of a chapter in performance history, a sunset on the age of turbocharged combustion insanity. and the rise of a new epoch defined by volts, algorithms, and aerodynamic efficiency. Perhaps the most poetic truth about the Focus RS is that its discontinuation ensured its immortality. Had it lingered into a compromised hybrid form, or been forced into an EV platform that dulled its wild personality, the RS could have lost the very qualities that made it legendary. Instead, by ending abruptly at its peak, it froze itself in time, forever remembered as one of the most unapologetic, aggressive, and charismatic performance hatchbacks ever produced. Its legacy isn't one of slow decline, but a brilliant intensity followed by a sudden departure, like a band that releases one perfect album and then stops before diluting its impact. Today, the final generation of the Focus RS stands as a monument to what performance cars once were: raw, mechanical, dramatic, and defiantly analog in spirit. It remains a reminder that the automotive world once allowed room for madness, for engineers to chase thrills rather than just efficiency charts. The RS didn't vanish because it lost relevance. Its relevance simply belonged to a world that no longer exists. In its absence, the industry marches on toward electrification and sustainability, but the legend of the Focus RS only grows louder, carried by the enthusiasts who still feel its spirit in every crackle, every surge of boost, and every moment when a piece of mechanical artistry shows what passion-driven engineering once looked like before the world changed forever.